What's up, everybody? Today I'm going to talk to you about my process for knocking out. What is knocking out, you might ask? Well, it's essentially the procedure for transferring, aerating, and crashing your wort when you're moving from your boil kettle to your fermenter. Simple as that. Okay, so let's talk about your goals when you're knocking out. There are really three main objectives you're trying to accomplish. First, you want to crash your wort from boiling down to your pitching temperature as soon as possible. Second, you're attempting to aerate your wort as efficiently as possible. And third, you're looking to create a sanitary transfer. So let me go into those things in a little more detail just to kind of explain the reason for being. First of all, crashing your temp as soon as possible. There are really three main sub-goals by doing this. First, you're minimizing the risk of infection in that 140 Fahrenheit to 90 degree Fahrenheit range. That's where bacteria can basically thrive the most. So by getting down through that as quickly as possible, you minimize that risk. Two, you're also minimizing the amount of time that your hops have to isomerize or create additional bitterness units or IBUs. So think about, you create your recipe, you throw in your 60-minute hops, maybe add some 20-minute hops, your whirlpool hops, etc. And you're kind of designing this recipe based off of all that timing. Well, if it takes you 30 minutes or 45 minutes or an hour to get from boiling down to your pitch temperature, that time that you're staying in isomerization range, so I'd say anything above 150 degrees Fahrenheit, you're going to be still pulling IBUs out of those hops. So now suddenly that 20-minute addition that you added, well, that's going to be more like a 30 to 45-minute addition IBU-wise. So definitely something you want to keep in mind if you've got a really long knockout time. Finally, the other critical piece of this is by going from boiling to crashing as quickly as possible, you're essentially shocking small proteins out of solution. So if you've got a clear fermenter and you're using a heat exchanger or something, you'll often see all of this protein matter sell out to the bottom within an hour or so after knocking out. These are the small proteins that I'm talking about. And some of these actually have the potential to be haze-forming proteins later in life. The second main objective, aerating your wort. So there's again, kind of 3 or 4 things there that you're looking to accomplish. By properly aerating your wort, you're reducing your lag time, you're going to get more generations out of your yeast, and then finally you're going to probably have a faster and healthier fermentation. All really, really super critical things to maintaining good yeast health. Now, aerating your wort is only a small part of establishing good yeast health, but it's a great place to start. And then finally, the third major objective is you're trying to create a sanitary transfer. So, you don't want to be, in an ideal world, you don't want to be, pouring buckets back and forth, or, connecting lines and disconnecting things, and sanitizing things and reconnecting things. You want to basically set up your connections once, and then be able to just knock out right into your vessel. So, by doing that, essentially, it's another area where we can reduce risk of infection or microbial pickup, and then also, for those of you that are pushing with sani, or pushing sani out your lines with your beer or water, whatever, gives you the ability to get all of that stuff out before you switch over to your fermenter and start knocking out into your fermenter. Okay, so here's my setup. It looks fairly complicated, but honestly, it's really broken down into just 3 or 4 main components, most of which being those items that I discussed. Having it go through my heat exchanger to knock the temperature down as quickly as possible. I've got an aeration stone in here to get oxygen into the line. I've got my thermometer here to check my actual knockout temperature, make sure I'm in line there. And then I've got a various amount of valves to control flow, control temperature, pull cold samples off for testing my final gravity, so on and so forth. So we'll walk through this kind of one by one, starting from the boil kettle to all the way through to the fermenter. So boil kettle, essentially inside, I've got a dip tube that goes down just to about maybe a 1/4 inch off the bottom, so I can get as much wort out of there as possible. From there, I've got a valve going to a T. This T, I'd normally have a valve on here, but I'm a bit short. This T basically allows me to put water in through my manifold, essentially, to get to other places. But for knockout, usually this is closed off and there's no water going in. It goes over to my pump, which I've got the Blickman Riptide, and it's got this cool little valve built right into it. So open this guy, and then I have it going over into my heat exchanger. And so wort in, water out, wort out, water in. And there's a couple of key valve placements that I want to talk to you guys about really quick. So first of all, you notice I have a valve on the wort outside of my heat exchanger. This is really, really super important because think about the heat exchanger and what this looks like on the inside. So there's all these little nooks and crannies and spots where essentially air can get trapped in there, or really you're not spots where you're not maximizing that surface area to the counterflow liquid that's coming through there. So by having a valve here where you can kind of choke off that flow, and it really allows you to pack 100% of this area with wort, so that you're really maximizing that surface area ratio and getting the best knockout. Essentially, in addition, it lets you slow that flow rate down as well, if you need to. So it gives it more time in contact with the cold water counterflow, allowing you to further control or reduce your temperature. Especially in the summer months, this is particularly important when your groundwater is pretty much close to your knockout temperature. Or higher, depending on where you live. Fortunately for me, it doesn't get much hotter than 68, 70 degrees. So we go out here, and then I've got a T here with a valve. What this allows me to do is I can actually pull just a small sample of wort from here, which is at essentially my temperature at this point. So I don't have to cool it down or anything, and I can take my gravity reading just right there. And it makes it super easy. Then I've got a 4-way here, and on this 4-way, again, I've got my temperature, I've got an oxygen stone, and then I've got a sight glass. So we'll start down here. Essentially it's just a oxygen stone that's welded to a 1/2 inch NPT thread that I've got into a threaded triclover there, so I can just connect it directly. That goes over to my oxygen tank, and I've just got this pretty inexpensive regulator on here, which allows you to basically set the liters per minute, which is cool. So at the lowest at 0.12, it goes up to 0.51, and then it goes all the way up to 8. But generally I'm going to stay in the 0.5 to 1 range, and that all depends on how fast I'm able to knock out. But we'll talk about that in a second. Essentially you want to minimize the amount of time that your knockout is, but at the same time you want to make sure it's long enough to get that oxygen in solution. So again, temperature, making sure that your temp is actually where you want it to be, and you can control that again by opening or closing your flow valve for the wort out. Finally, I've got a sight glass here. This is to verify the condition and clarity of the wort coming out, but also more importantly to make sure that my oxygen stone is actually flowing. These guys, the holes are so small in there that even oil from your hand can kind of clog them up. So making sure they're really super clean is important. But especially during knockout, you want to make sure that you're actually getting bubbles and oxygen in there. It's a really good way of verifying that that's actually happening. And then finally, you want to make sure that the knockout line that you have is long, but also a consistent length. If you're always, jumping back and forth between, 1 foot and a 20 foot or whatnot, it's going to mess with how much oxygen actually gets dissolved into solution. So mine's about 4 feet. I keep it, I keep the same one for all my knockouts. And getting back to what we were talking about earlier, that flow rate really determines how much oxygen I have my oxygen stone pumping out, so how many liters per minute. And that's based off of the temperature. But if I jam that all into my fermenter as quickly as possible, that oxygen isn't really going to have enough time to totally absorb in there. And if my line was too short, I wouldn't have enough restriction or kind of back pressure to make sure that that oxygen was being dissolved. It would all simply just go right into my fermenter and then come up and then out by blow off here. So finally, when we're talking about oxygen, there's one key thing to mention. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Depending on the strain of yeast that you're using, the gravity, a bunch of other factors, that oxygen requirement is going to be vastly different. So I guess the key point being that knowing or understanding that every yeast strain has its own dependencies on oxygen. Some actually do way better with low amounts of oxygen, while others need 15, 16 parts per million oxygen in the wort in order for them to be successful. A lot of this information, particularly like fermentation temperatures and other things, can be found off of White Lab's website. So these guys got a nice little koozie from them. But checking out the write-ups that they have for each of their different yeast strains is super important. Again, knowing that temperature range that particular yeast likes to be for the best health and amount of esters and flavor profiles, that's going to go a really long way. Some of that stuff though isn't published. I think as far as like aeration, I've kind of just guesstimated based off of various things that I've found online where people have kind of tested different oxygen levels for different yeast strains. But if you think about it, unless you have an oxygen meter, you're really not going to be able to truly know how well you're aerating your wort anyway. So it's all kind of guesswork, but generally what I do is for certain strains, I'll go 1 liter per minute. This is going to be like your Chico strains, SD Super Yeast, or 001, or the equivalents for those guys out there. But yeah, definitely check those out. Read up on your yeast before you kind of just jump in and start doing things blindly, because it does make an impact. Anyways, so that's my knockout setup. I think that's all of the information that I can kind of brain dump at the moment. Again, if you have any questions about anything, definitely let's start a discussion down in the comments, and we can elaborate on some of the things that I'm probably forgetting. Anyways, thanks for watching the video, and let's see you, Anyways, thanks for watching the video, like, subscribe, etc. And definitely love to hear from you. Alright, cheers!